Welcome to the Phi Picket House. We're a small group today, but I'm happy that we're here and gathered to hear Beverly West Leach's presentation. We are gathered here in the wonderful, fantastic, and oldest historic home in Montgomery, built in 1837. Has a long and interesting history, and if you're interested in more information about that, you can read about that on our website. This beautiful exhibit that we're sitting amongst, Doris Alexander Thompson, painter, lithographer, and novelist, is a retrospective highlighting Thompson's life and work. The exhibit features many examples of the process of how she worked and over 40 of her individual artworks. Thompson sketched, transferred compositions to stone, and produced prints. Stone lithography, invented in 1798, and now nearly extinct, uses limestone slabs and requires specialized skill. Each lithograph printed from the original stone is a unique work and considered original. With every exhibit that we do here, our objective is to encourage people to explore different Montgomery historic sites. So I hope that this exhibit, both art and history, will encourage you to do just that. Let me take just a second to thank a few people for all of the good things that make programs like this and exhibits like this a success. Financial support is in thanks to Alabama Humanities Alliance, Alabama State Council on the Arts, and the City of Montgomery. Beverly West Leach for being here today to both share and help educate all of us. And Dixie Art Colony Foundation, led by Mark Harris, for loaning all of these incredible works and paraphernalia for us to look and learn. Let me now introduce our speaker. Beverly West Leach, now a retired art educator, isn't that fantastic? Worked as a graphic designer for 20 years before she and her husband relocated from Baltimore, Maryland to Southeast Alabama. Her educational background is in fine art, with a BFA from the Columbus College of Art and Design in Columbus, Ohio, and an MFA from the Pennsylvania State University in State College, Pennsylvania. Her work has been exhibited throughout the United States in juried exhibitions and in solo and group shows. Beverly's work is also part of several corporate collections and the Baltimore Museum of Arts and Print and Drawing Collection. Beverly, thank you. We look forward to everything you're about to share.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate everyone being here today. And my talk is going to focus on what is the lithography process and some of the artists that I feel Doris Alexander Thompson would have known their work or been influenced by. So when I looked at her body of work, artists that came to my mind that I think she may have encountered, because these would be artists that lived and worked during her time period. Mostly this is about lithography and process, not so much the artistic history of Doris Alexander Thompson, but I've included a lot of archival imagery that shows her at work in the process. So I was very excited that the Dixie Art Colony had these resources, because printmaking is a rather involved process. I wanted to start this talk to explain the 4 basic processes that an artist would use for printmaking. And mostly artists would choose to work in prints so they could make, I'm struggling with to say the word, a more inexpensive work of art versus a painting or a sculpture. Prints tend to be priced a little less than paintings or sculptures, not in all cases, because there's a multiple involved. So you have multiple images of the exact same drawing or other process the artist might use to create the image. But what intaglio entails is etching or carving down into a surface. It could be a metal plate, and then ink is pushed down into those crevices, and the excess ink that sits on the surface is wiped off, and then damp paper with a lot of pressure is used to pull that image out of those incise lines. So the word intaglio means below the surface. In screen printing, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, because I bet at home in your closet you have t-shirts that have images of your favorite teams or universities, etc. And screen printing is a process that does not require the flipped image, meaning when you put the silk screen or screen, any kind of nylon fabric in the modern age, what you see is what you get. The actual wording doesn't have to be in reverse because you're pushing ink through a stencil and layering colors. Relief printing is on the surface. You print in relief. Maybe you've used things like rubber stamps where the rubber is carved. So the white area that you would see in a rubber stamp is carved away, but the top area is where the roller or an ink pad would capture your ink and make that pattern. But in lithography, the lithography process is a flat process. I happen to have a stone right next to me. What's great about this exhibit is you see many of Alexander Thompson's stones and the actual prints that are pulled. In the upper corner of that image, I had found on the Dixie Art Colony website, they actually have Thompson's press, which I thought, these presses are rare now. Most universities aren't doing stone lithography anymore. And these lithostones, depending on the size, can be rather heavy, so you sometimes need hydraulic equipment to move them around the studio. But what I wanted to address early on in the talk is the difference between a litho press and a traditional etching press. So in this image, you can see this bar. And that bar comes down on top of the edge of the stone, and the whole bed of the press pushes under that bar. You don't need as much pressure in lithography as you do in etching or intaglio. This is just a roller to roll the ink, so that's not really involved in the print process. But I chose this image because it looked like a time era close to the kind of press that Alexander Thompson would have used. In intaglio or relief, the bed, the bottom area where you'd actually put your plate, could be metal, could be wood, in either relief or intaglio, and the roller move together. So the roller on top moves like this, and the bed rolls, and you can really tighten the pressure on the press so you can get the dampened paper to go down into the crevices for intaglio, or sometimes in the relief process, you might want what's called an embossing, where the physical action of the matrix, could be the piece of wood or plate, actually indent the surface of the paper a little bit, or embosses. But in lithography, you don't need that kind of pressure because the image is held, well, I'll get to that. It's held with grease and water. I'm briefly going to touch on when this process was first invented in Germany in the late 1700s. And it was mostly used as a practical means, not necessarily an artistic means, for things like music scores and maps. So how would you reproduce a piece of paper where a musician might write their notation for that musical score? Well, how would you distribute it? Instead of just writing it out by hand every time, you could etch it into the lithostone. I tried to find a little history, like how did he discover this? And then I thought, oh, I think that might get too technical or I was bored by it, so I thought you'd be bored by it too. So I'm not really sure how they discovered this. But what I wanted to point out, when you look at the stone image on the right, you can see that the type is etched in reverse. So the stone, or in intaglio or relief, the artist would have to carefully think about, if they are using words, the words and lettering have to be backwards, because the plate or the stone, you put the piece of paper down, and that makes the mirrored kind of image, the reverse image. Where in screen printing, when you push ink through the stencil, it's right reading, so you don't need to think in reverse. When I would do my own prints, even when I would do representational landscapes, it didn't matter too much to me if the tree was on the right or the left. Every artist and their approach would be different, especially with portraiture or typography, where you, the viewer, would want to read it the right way. But in lithography, it's a planographic process, meaning a very flat process. If you look at some of these stones and gently, I don't know how Mark feels about people touching, because we have grease, well, we're not using these to make art, but you'll notice it's very flat and smooth, even though this could hold ink, which I'll get to. But the process is based on the idea that grease or oil, as in the ink, repels water. So the process would require this stone to be gently dampened. So the surface is still very, very flat. That's why the printing press doesn't have the roller and the pressure. It's just a bar that kind of presses onto the stone to release the grease onto the ink, onto the paper. And in the lithography process, you do not dampen the paper as in other printmaking processes. So in intaglio, you soak the paper so the cotton or other fibers of that paper can receive the heavy pressure and go down into the nooks and crannies to release the image. Where in lithography, it's just that bar that slides across the stone, or it could be a aluminum plate, and the grease just adheres onto the undampened paper. Some artists might dampen the paper like with a spritz, but you don't soak it like in other processes. And in screen printing, you don't soak the paper at all, or in textile printing. All right, so the image is drawn a variety of ways. And the materials are different kinds of greases, is the best way I could explain it. And what's in the back case in the middle of the room here are several kinds of crayons and marking pencil tools that Doris Alexander Thompson used in the imagery you see in this. The chemical processing I'll explain, and I have some archival images that show Doris Alexander Thompson working on her stones as we proceed here. But the idea is, wherever you've applied the grease or the ink, you, as the artist, apply a light etch, and that makes the, well, I'm jumping ahead. But as I just said, the stone needs to remain damp. That's why you see the sponge here. And in that image, the artist has inked up the stone, but prior to inking at the end of processing her stone, she would use a dampened sponge. It's not a lot of water. The whole process is rather delicate, although commercial offset lithography is the exact same principle, but then with aluminum plates on big rollers. I didn't include any of those kind of modern day images because I might have you all confused already, because I'm so tactile, because it's a very tactile, very complex kind of process. So what I wanted to stay focused on was more how the artwork you see in this display is all about drawing and the kind of materials that lend itself to observing the natural world, although I have some contemporary prints we'll look at in a moment. But these two images are showing you how the artist, as they would print their images, would have to keep the image area slightly dampened. And in many printmaking studios, or when I was in graduate school, sometimes you'd work as a team, and that's what this image is showing, where one person would definitely be responsible for keeping the stone surface gently moistened, and the other person would use the leather roller to keep the ink up. And
Beverly, can I,
sure.
like, relevant to this?
Sure.
So if it's damp with a sponge, but there's ink or grease, does it not lift off when you're?
That's a very good question. And the reason it won't lift off, well, it can go terribly wrong quickly if you don't keep the stone slightly moistened. Because the minute the stone surface would dry, then you don't have the grease water repelling, and if you ink the roller across the stone, you're just going to get a big inky square. But I'll proceed, because that was a great question. So I'll come back to that, because the next 2 slides will explain it. So what an artist will do, what I noticed that our collection has here are many of Doris Alexander Thompson's sketchbooks. And I found her imagery based on the observable world, where this artist, and I'm not sure who that artist is, it was just an image I grabbed off the internet, but I liked how it showed someone at work where you could see the terracotta lines, those are the red lines. Those aren't grease, they're like a powdery chalk, and you could do a preliminary drawing on your stone without putting grease down, and then go back with your grease tools. And so he has in that little dish liquid tush, it's a kind of grease, so you can dilute that liquid and get different kind of wash effects like in a watercolor, or different kind of painting effects, or take a brush and do little speckly dot effects. So there are liquid forms of grease that you can paint with, or crayons, different kinds of sizes and hardnesses and softnesses, where you can make many different kind of marks and build the marks up slowly. And that's what I noticed in most of the prints here on display, would be a building up of maybe cross-hatched lines or different kind of drawing marks that build up from very light, the white surface of the paper, to very dark, where it gets very filled in. So in this process, I'm still going to address the process without getting too technical, but I wanted to show you a couple historic prints first. You might not be aware of the fact that artists in the 1800s were using this process. I feel that artists are always on the forefront of technology. Okay, we talk now in our vernacular about AI and digital drawing, and depending on what side of the fence you're on, you might think, oh, it's the end of art. Well, I don't think so. I just think the computer and digital technology is just another tool an artist is going to use. So when you think of the lithographic process, this was radical. It was the technology of its day. Look, we're going to print a bunch of maps. We're going to print a bunch of music scores. We're going to distribute imagery. You don't have to physically go to the museum. We can sell you a print to take home. I mean, so artists have always embraced technology and science. Art and science go hand in hand. So in printmaking, in this process, there's a lot of science involved that I don't understand. However, I understood how to utilize it to make imagery. And you might be familiar with the artist Jericho and the Raft of the Medusa, this mammoth painting that hangs in the Louvre that describes this very horrific historic event. I don't know the history or why this particular artist did the imagery of the boxers. But what I noticed in the print right away was the way it was drawn with a series of overlapping kind of marks, fewer marks, lighter value, more marks, darker value. And then I noticed the different races. And this is about the slave trade, and I'm just going to leave it there and not get too. I just feel like there's probably a political statement he's making there, but I have no research to back it up. But when I saw the image and how beautifully drawn it was, I just wanted you to understand that this process of lithography goes back a few hundred years. I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with Impressionism. Maybe not Manet specifically, but you probably know Monet, water lilies, or post-impressionism like Vincent van Gogh. And as I was looking for historical imagery, like how far back did this technique go, where artists embraced it as just part of their studio practice, what Manet has in common with Alexander Thompson is he did drawing and did this kind of stonework in his studio just like she did. I learned something new. Thank you, Mark, for inviting me. And when I saw this, I thought, well, this is a very contemporary way to draw. You know, Manet got a lot of flack in his day. We would think, oh, that's very realistic, and why would people be upset with this? Well, first, she's just a barmaid. She's not a famous historical person. Second, he would let the brushstrokes show and maybe pump up the chroma of the hue and have things be a little more juicy as painting. And this whole reflected image, it's just a painting I've always admired. And Manet, in these lithos I came across, he wasn't afraid to just use marks like we'd see artists use today. To our eye, this is how an artist draw, but in his day, it would have been more traditional, like a little more modeled and softened and more real. So Manet isn't really considered an impressionist, but he's on that cusp, and he knew Degas and other impressionists, but sometimes in history books he's referred to as a realist. Probably the most famous origins of what the general public would know about lithography is Toulouse-Lautrec and these Moulin Rouge poster prints. So these would be printed to, you know, here's the events and the famous people of the day, the dancer Jane Avril, and Lautrec in these posters would have to use multiple stones because every color you see here, from the black to the orange to maybe a peach to a yellow, you would need a different stone, or at least the same stone that you process. And on the back table is a series of one of Doris Alexander Thompson's prints where you can see the layering of the color. So in a lot of graphic design history books, these images are shown. So the connection to science, history, and advertising all filters into what printmaking is. This is just a beautiful drawing by Lautrec, and because it connected to the Manet and the horse races. So that's the only reason I'm showing you that, but it's also in the High Museum of Art collection. So as I put together the slide deck, I was thinking, well, what artists do we have in our community that possibly Doris Alexander Thompson would have seen their work? She was well-traveled, and she did go to school at Temple University, so she would have known the Impressionist work. I'm just not sure about their prints. I'm sure she would have known those Lautrec prints, but I'm saying I'm sure, but I obviously can't be sure because I've never met her to ask her. So a little bit of historical prints. Now I'm just going to walk you through the actual process, and hopefully this answers your prior comment. So in the process, you take the stone, and you take carborundum grit, which is like sandpaper. So it's like sandpaper in a big jar, and you have different grits from very coarse that you start with to very fine. So if any of you have done woodworking, you start very coarse to fine to get that smooth surface, and that's a levigator. So this kind of motion, with lots of water and lots of grinding, you grind the surface of the stone to remove the grease. So it's not as rigorous as sanding and woodworking or, you know, finishing a sculpture or anything like that. But you do need to remove all the grease, And you also need to make sure that the stone is very level. So any added pressure, if you stay in a spot too long and if you make the surface uneven, you won't get good ink adhere. So you have to make sure this is really smooth and even. So what a lot of people will do is cut little strips of paper, and you have a heavy metal bar, and if the paper doesn't slide through the bar, then you know through the stone it's very level. What I enjoyed about the printmaking process is it's a very physical process versus, well, drawing and painting can be very physical, but just the whole prep, there's a whole physical process involved. After you get the stone perfectly smooth, all the grease removed through the carborundum and the levigator, you then begin your drawing. There are ways you can transfer the drawing with that Conte crayon, but you have to use things that aren't greasy. Like a graphite pencil actually has a little bit of grease, so you don't draw your preliminary drawing with a graphite pencil. It would have to be a Conte crayon that doesn't, it's more powdery than greasy. And you can make all kinds of marks. You can use that liquid tush like you would use in watercolor, and you dilute that so you can make washes. You can make strong, bold, linear marks. You can paint with it in bold marks. So there's a variety of marks that an artist can create depending on the drawing tool they use. Also, if you have a dark area and you take a sharp tool like a razor blade or an etching needle, you can actually scratch into that, and the next steps where you use gum arabic and acid will actually keep those little areas white, and I'll show you in a moment. This image I included that I got off of the Dixie Art Colony website because I thought, I think this image is actually in one of the cases here in the show, but it just shows her drawing with a grease pencil directly on the stone from one of her sketchbook drawings. And what I liked about this image is it shows some of her other work and interests she had in drawing. I think artists that were using the litho process early on, because drawing was such an integral part of their practice, it was just a natural extension of doing their sketchbook drawings. The etching process, so when I'm saying etching here, I don't mean going down into the surface. What I mean is the artist is using gum arabic. It's kind of clear and slightly viscous, like a thick gel, and a few drops of nitric acid. And different effects, and I'm only going to touch the surface here because I'm rusty in the science of it all in a way. But stronger acids can etch thicker, globbier grease, and weaker acids are meant for the lighter, more delicate kind of pencil marks with the grease pencil. So in many art printmaking studios, there'd be a chart, like how much acid to how much gum arabic. Kind of like baking, you have to have a recipe. And what happens is where you don't see the grease, the etch activates the pores in the stone so they'll hold water, because we're going on the principle that water's going to repel the grease. Then the grease isn't affected by the etch, just the areas around the grease. So if I have a light wash, there's all different levels of grease. The acid interacts with that, just like a pencil mark too. You know, when you make a mark, and if you look at her work, it looks just like a pencil kind of mark. You see the little open areas. The gum arabic isn't so thick that it doesn't adhere to the stone surface. It adheres very well, so little bits of acid go around any little grease mark. So you can get delicate areas and big, bold areas too. So in this photo, what you notice here, you see the words gum arabic on the jar, and that's her nitric acid because there's the eyedropper. So her scale of prints and the size of these stones are very manageable in a one-person studio. You know, she could get this onto the press bed and these stones are kind of heavy. But I was really thrilled to see that she actually had this photo shoot. This is from the same day when she was drawing on the image, and now what she's doing here is processing the image to make the surface of the stone hold the water. So after that etching step, you wash out all the grease with turpentine. Sometimes artists add liquid asphaltum. So what you see in this image, the upper part of the image, the grease is being removed, and then it looks like there's no drawing. This is the scary part. Your stone will look empty, but you could apply this liquid asphaltum. It's kind of thick, and it's kind of like really super dark coffee is the kind of color. And that step assures that the grease really holds and repels the water. I was just letting you read those words. I try not to read all the words because it gets boring for you if I repeat what's on the slide. Now, in the last step, you're going to ink up the stone. And what you have to do, especially if you're doing it on your own, is you use a soft sponge and a little bit of water, and you keep the surface damp. And then you use, traditionally it's a leather roller. The leather surface has a little give, and the lithographic ink is more greasy than intaglio or etching inks. There's a whole science to the inks that I won't get into, but there's all slightly different. And in this diagram that I thought was pretty important so it would help you understand what I'm trying to convey is if you looked under a magnifying glass, you might see the little pits where the grease, although this feels very flat, the grease is slightly above where the water's going to sit. Now again, it's a very, very flat surface, but there is a little relief. So in some respects, it's sort of, I'll have you confused if I say a relief process, but really the ink is sitting away from the water, but slightly raised. Not very dramatically raised. And in some studios, especially in modern day printmaking, where artists might work in a very, very large scale, you'll have a team of people. So when I was at Penn State, we always worked as a team because the person inking the stone, you really have to pay attention because if you don't apply the exact same amount of ink after you've decided this is how I want my image to be, and you roll too many times and too much ink or not enough ink, the prints won't all match. So usually one person will keep the stone slightly damp and the other person will do the rolling because you have to keep the count in your head. And you can see the litho press and the roller, or I mean to say the litho bar. The bar is usually the width of your actual image or slightly longer. It's never the whole width of the stone. Usually all litho stones, there'll be some kind of 2 or 3 inch border where you protect that from grease. You don't want to print off the edge of the stone, and you don't want a lot of pressure because you don't want to crack your stones, right? It's a very different kind of process. And in this image, we see Alexander Thompson inking up her image. I think that same brayer is in the cabinet back here too, on display, in that vitrine. And you can see here, I think she just staged this for the photo shoot itself, but she would have run that through the press, and you can see, in some of her prints I noticed too, she might have her name signed ahead, but again, that typography would have to be mirrored in reverse. Now, the next group of images don't really focus on her art, but I wanted to show you this because during the 30s and early 40s, this kind of style of rural American art through the public, the Works Progress Administration, artists were hired to travel and go around and do drawings of the American spirit or the American ideal. And in these images of rural America and hiring artists to document was trying to keep the economy going. I couldn't imagine what it was like to be an artist or any citizen in the 30s and early 40s. Very difficult times of war and depression. But the artwork generated in that time period had a very kind of social conscious documentation kind of look to it. So I saw a connection to Thomas Hart Benton, and he did a lot of lithography, and he was also the teacher to Jackson Pollock. And there's a certain kind of style in the way the clouds or the human form is even drawn. And the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts, about 2 or 3 years ago, maybe a little longer, purchased 4 Thomas Hart Benton lithos. These aren't those particular images, but I thought I'd let you know that the Montgomery Museum had a good holding of his lithos. And I would believe that Alexander Thompson was aware of his work. He was super well known during this time period. I don't know if she would have been familiar with Diego Rivera's prints. However, he was traveling around the United States doing many murals and mural projects, kind of in tandem with the Works Progress Administration. And there was this very particular look to these images about famous people. Perhaps I didn't Google and look up this particular image, like why that man is important. But what I saw in the image was more a stylistic connection to the artwork on display here. But what I wanted to mention and why I included this is in printmaking in particular, artists will take risks about social commentary. So sometimes the prints, because you could mass produce them, they can be very topical and reflective of here and now, the moment, historically. So depending on the artist's interest, one could be very political with prints. So there's a long history of that in printmaking, going all the way back to Goya in the Spanish Inquisition. But I didn't include those because those were etchings. So those few images I showed you about art that I think she would have known in her lifetime, I juxtaposed these 2 images and moved forward in time, well, somewhat forward, still the 30s, with M.C. Escher. You might be familiar with M.C. Escher tessellations in more mathematical or fantastical art. But when I saw this reflection that she had done her self-portrait in this percolator, this image popped right into my head. And I knew M.C. Escher he's a master draftsman. And I see her work as really reliant on eye-hand coordination and draftsmanship. So in my mind, the idea of the reflection and copying what it is you see. And he would draw direct on stone or plate. Some of his lithographs are on aluminum plates. But he also would draw on actual stone, just direct to the stone, just like we saw in that one image of Alexander Thompson working. Now, the only reason I'm showing you this was just, since I showed you that reflection, this might be an image by M.C. Escher you'd be somewhat familiar with. And it's a kind of image you could turn multiple ways and still feel orientated in space. And he would have had to done his chop or signature mark in reverse in that lower corner. But these kind of drawing marks where you're using a pencil and layering from very light to dark was what I saw a kinship with the work we have on display here. I included that because I found that artists during the 30s, especially 40s and 50s, the idea of abstraction started to really enter the art world with the next generation of artists. Like, you know, I mentioned how Jackson Pollock was a student of Thomas Hart Benton. And this image, to me, I just was really drawn to it. So that's the only reason I included it, is you can see the stone's texture, you can see the linear marks, but you also see in her work what was going on in the zeitgeist of the time, that whole flow of going from realism to experimenting with abstraction. And I noticed on the Dixie Art Colony website, just trying to categorize some of her more abstract works and a connection to surrealism, which in the 40s and 50s, especially in the 50s, really started to take off. So that's why I included this litho by Joan Moreau. I think you're all probably familiar with the work of Salvador Dali, and he did a lot of printmaking, but in that big commercial sense, you know, galleries and money and the whole art market really started to explode in that 50s and 60s. And Moreau did a lot of printmaking as well. I don't see quite the same visual connection as I saw in Thomas Hart Benton to her work and M.C. Escher. However, when I saw that litho by Alexander Thompson, I thought of this image by Matisse, because there's so many changes in art happening in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and you have the upheaval of World War II and all the artists that leave the European continent for New York City and all that explosion into abstract expressionism and pop art. But Matisse did color lithography, and there's a very famous painting of his wife in this very ornate hat. But this is an actual litho from that painting. So I was like, oh yeah. And I noticed the date, 1954, and I'm not sure I have the date connected in hers, but somehow they spoke to me. And I'm thinking she studied in Philadelphia. She would go back there every summer. I was thinking she probably knew of Matisse's Fauvist paintings. And maybe not that particular painting, but somehow the two clicked in my head. Now, one thing I wanted to say, because I wasn't sure how familiar everybody was with printmaking and what artists do, but this image, and what I circled in the lower corner, I was trying to zoom in, but when an artist goes through the trouble of making a drawing or a matrix, so a matrix is what holds the image so you can repeat it over and over again. An edition of fine art prints are an exact match of a group of prints. So an artist will do a lot of proofs, a lot of experimenting, and once they get to the stage they really want it to be, they'll pull what's called an AP, artist proof. Then they'll look at that, and then every print that's in the edition matches to that artist proof. And I think there's a couple proofs here on display. But the fraction number that you see there circled, 2/10, that would be the second exact print out of a group of 10. So if you lined up all 10 prints, they would be identical. And this print, the island, oh, I know it's in the later 50s or maybe 62. I don't know why 1962. I meant to put the date there. But what excited me about that, it kind of echoed what you start to see in abstract expressionism and how she's seeing the landscape still as it is with the reflection and the trees, but then it's also very abstract at the same time. So through her lifetime, as when you look at a whole body of work through an artist's lifetime, you'll see these changes and how things reflect the world around them and the art movements and styles of the day. Now to end with, I have 3 different artists I thought I'd share with you. I don't see a visual connection like the other work I just showed you, but I thought you'd be interested in some contemporary lithography specifically. And Jim Dine is associated with the pop art movement, meaning I don't mean pop art like zim, zoom, bang like that, or like Andy Warhol and soup cans. However, he would take everyday objects, robes, or tools, and just render them in a variety of ways and do a whole series. I chose Jim Dine because there are some Jim Dine prints that are part of the Wiregrass Museum of Art's collection. I didn't check the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts website, but there probably would be a Jim Dine in their collection too. He's still alive. Very collectible. His studio practice was mostly in printmaking, where most artists of his time, he did a lot of painting too, but would be mostly painting. Robert Rauschenberg is one of my art heroes, and he experimented with printmaking. So in contemporary lithography, this idea of transferring images from offset lithography. So the two processes work the same way, just one's on a big industrial scale on aluminum plates and big rollers. But he would take these printed images and use a solvent that would transfer it onto another surface. It could be a lithostone or an aluminum plate. So in lithography, an aluminum plate is the counterpart to the lithostone. And he would do these collage images. And the last image I'm showing you is Frank Stella, because within our own Wiregrass community, the Wiregrass Museum of Art has a big holding of Frank Stella prints that often get asked to go on travel to other exhibitions. So they have a series through a professor, Dr. Hood, who's long since retired from Troy University. And in contemporary printmaking, this mixing of many different print mediums or print styles. The image on the right that's more geometric is stone lithography. So that's a true litho and just bright colors. But this is a mixed media, I would say. It's etching and intaglio and lithography, and these are huge scale. So that is where I'm going to end, kind of a history from the 1818 all the way up to 1991. But thank you for your time. Do you have questions? Or we could sit around and chat if you would like. Before I sit around and chat, I'll see if you have questions, though.
And I'm not sure I'm very big on art. So, to get them to be the same, they had to repeat along the way.
Correct. Thank you.
All the time to get it to be the same.
I don't know if I ever answered your question, really, but I'm going to answer your question first. Yes. So when they pull in addition, the goal is to have each print identical, and they'll know how walk up.